Sometimes the deepest wounds are carried by those who once protected everyone else. We all know someone who has built walls so high that love itself cannot climb over them. Duke Merek was such a man. He lived alone in his castle above the village of Eldenmere. Everyone feared him. No one would work for him. He had lost his family to plague, and his heart had turned to stone. But one winter day, a small orphan girl walked up to his gate. She had nothing, no shoes, no coat, no family. She looked at this feared man and asked one simple question that changed everything. She asked if he was lonely. The Duke let her stay. What happens next will show you that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can heal the biggest hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the stone corridors of Blackmoor Keep like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the bitter cold of another merciless winter. Duke Merek stood at the tall window of his solar, watching the snow fall in thick, silent curtains across the vale below. His reflection stared back at him, a man of 43 years who looked far older, his once golden hair now streaked with premature silver. His blue eyes dulled to the color of winter ice. Above the great fireplace hung his war sword, its blade dark with neglect. 3 years had passed since he last touched its worn leather grip. 3 years since he had been anything more than a shadow haunting his own castle. The weapon that had once defended kingdoms now gathered dust, much like the man who had wielded it. Eldenmere village spread out below the keep like a collection of children's toys scattered in the snow. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey streams, and Merek could see the tiny figures of villagers hurrying between buildings, their heads bent against the wind. They never looked up toward the castle anymore. Why would they? What comfort could they find in the sight of his fortress when its master had become their greatest fear? It had not always been this way. Once this very window had framed scenes of joy, festivals in the village square, children playing in summer meadows, merchants traveling safely along roads he had sworn to protect. Once laughter had echoed through these halls, and warmth had filled every room. Lyanna had loved this window. She would stand here in the mornings, her auburn hair catching the light as she watched their daughter Roslyn play in the courtyard below. Her voice would fill the air as she hummed old ballads while arranging wildflowers in clay vases. The solar had been alive then, filled with tapestries and cushions, books and music, the gentle chaos of a family's daily life. Now the room stood bare, save for the essential furniture. Merek had ordered everything else removed after the fever took them both. He could not bear to see Lyanna's embroidery hoop sitting empty by the fire, or Roslyn's small wooden dolls scattered across the carpet where she had left them that final morning when she was too weak to play. The plague had come in late autumn, 3 years past. It swept through the village like a scythe through grain, taking the old and young alike. Merek had ridden out daily, bringing food and medicine, using his own coin to pay for physicians from distant cities. He had thought his family safe within the castle walls, protected by stone and distance and his own desperate vigilance. He was wrong. First, Roslyn fell ill, sweet Roslyn with her mother's green eyes and stubborn chin, only 5 years old and fierce as a young wildcat. She had fought the fever for 7 days, her small body burning hot as forge coals, while Lyanna sang to her and Merek paced the halls like a caged wolf. When the fever finally broke her, Lyanna had held their daughter's still form and wept until she had no tears left. Lyanna followed 3 days later. The grief had weakened her, the physician said, made her vulnerable to the very plague she had nursed their child through. Merek found her in their marriage bed, peaceful as sleep, one hand still reaching toward the small cot where Roslyn had breathed her last. That was the day the Duke of Eldenmere died. Though his body continued to walk the earth, the funeral had been the last time he spoke to his people as their protector rather than their tormentor. He had stood in the village cemetery, watching the wooden coffins disappear into the cold ground, listening to Father Benedict speak of mercy and eternal rest. The whole village had come to pay their respects, men he had fought beside, women who had helped Lyanna with her charity work, children who had played with Roslyn in the castle gardens. After that day, something broke inside him that could not be mended. The grief twisted into rage, the rage into bitterness, and the bitterness into a cold cruelty that drove away everyone who tried to reach him. His steward Thomas, who had served his family for 20 years, fled after Merek struck him for mentioning repairs to Roslyn's nursery. The cook who had made special cakes for his daughter's naming day left when he forbade any celebration or music in the castle. One by one, servant after servant packed their belongings and sought employment elsewhere, unable to bear the poisonous atmosphere their beloved lord had created. Now only 2 guards remained, men too desperate for coin to seek other positions. They kept to the gatehouse and avoided him when possible, emerging only to collect their wages or relay messages he had no interest in hearing. The great hall that had once seated 60 at feast times now echoed empty, its long tables covered in dust sheets like funeral shrouds. The village below had learned to fear his rare appearances. When Duke Merek rode out, it was never with good intentions. He came to collect taxes with ruthless efficiency, to settle disputes with harsh judgment, to remind his people that their lord was no longer the man who had once danced at their weddings and blessed their children. They scattered before him like leaves before a storm, mothers pulling their children indoors, merchants hastily closing their stalls. Yet even in his cruelty, Merek found no relief from the pain that ate at him like a cancer. Each night he sat alone in the solar, staring into the fire and drinking wine that tasted like ash. Each morning he woke to emptiness that grew larger rather than smaller with time. The castle that had once been filled with love now felt like a tomb, and he its most reluctant inhabitant. On this particular morning, as snow continued to fall and the wind rattled the ancient window panes, Merek noticed something unusual in the courtyard below. A small figure was making its way up the winding path to the castle gate, moving slowly through the deep snow. At first, he thought it might be one of the guards returning from the village, but as the figure drew closer, he realized it was far too small. A child. His jaw tightened as he watched the tiny form struggle through drifts that came nearly to its waist. What business could a child have at Blackmore Keep? Had some desperate parent sent their offspring to beg for mercy over unpaid taxes? He would soon disabuse them of such foolish notions. The child reached the great gate and stopped, looking up at the iron portcullis that barred entry to the castle. From his window high above, Merek could see it was a girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing little more than rags and no shoes at all. Her small feet must be freezing in the snow, yet she stood perfectly still, waiting for what? As if sensing his gaze, the child tilted her head back and looked directly up at his window. Even from this distance, Merek could see that she showed no sign of fear, no inclination to run. She simply stood there in the falling snow, studying the castle with the quiet patience of someone who had nowhere else to go. Something about that patience, that stillness, stirred a memory he had tried to bury. Roslyn had possessed that same quality, the ability to wait without fidgeting, to observe the world with solemn attention far beyond her years. For a moment, the resemblance was so strong that Merek's breath caught in his throat. Then the moment passed and only cold reality remained. This was not his daughter returned to him by some miracle. This was simply another village brat, no doubt sent to plague him with some petition or plea he had no intention of granting. But as he turned away from the window, intending to ignore the child until she gave up and went home, something made him pause. The girl's bare feet in the snow, the way she stood without trembling despite the cold, the absolute fearlessness in her upturned face. When had he last seen such courage? Against his better judgment, Duke Merek found himself walking toward the stairs that led down to the castle's main entrance. He would send the child away, of course, but he would do it properly, face to face, so there could be no mistake about his intentions. Perhaps, if he was sufficiently intimidating, word would spread through the village that Blackmore Keep was no place for uninvited guests. especially small ones who should know better than to venture out alone in such weather. Yes, that would be best. A quick, harsh dismissal, and then he could return to his solitude with the satisfaction of having maintained his reputation as a man to be feared. He had no way of knowing that the barefoot girl waiting at his gate would prove to be the one person in all the world who was utterly immune to fear, especially of him. The iron gate groaned as one of the remaining guards lifted the portcullis just enough for a man to pass through. Duke Merek emerged into the courtyard, his black cloak whipping around him in the bitter wind. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the small figure who waited with impossible patience by the castle entrance. Up close, she was even more ragged than he had realized. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a thin face marked by hunger and cold, yet her brown eyes held a brightness that seemed untouched by hardship. She wore a dress that had once been blue, but was now faded to grey, patched and repatched until more mending showed than original fabric. No cloak, no shawl, no shoes, just bare feet that should have been blue with frostbite, but somehow remained pink with life. What do you want? Merek's voice cracked across the courtyard like a whip, echoing off the stone walls with harsh authority. He had perfected this tone over 3 years of driving people away, cold, dismissive, promising swift punishment for anyone foolish enough to waste his time. The child looked up at him without flinching. If anything, her expression grew more curious, as if she were trying to solve some fascinating puzzle. "Are you the Duke?" she asked, her voice clear and steady despite the cold. "I am Duke Merek of Eldenmere, and you are trespassing on my lands." He loomed over her, using his considerable height to maximum intimidating effect. "State your business quickly or remove yourself from my sight." She tilted her head to one side, studying his face with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient text. "You look sad," she said finally. The simple observation hit him like a physical blow. Sad? He was not sad. He was angry, bitter, beyond the reach of such weak emotions. Sadness was for those who still had hope to lose. "I am nothing of the sort," he snapped. "Now answer my question, or are you lonely?" The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their simple meaning. Merek felt his carefully constructed armor of rage crack just slightly, allowing something he had buried deep to stir uncomfortably in his chest. "How dare you?" he whispered. But the menace he intended to convey came out sounding more lost than threatening. The girl, he realized he didn't even know her name, continued to regard him with those unnervingly direct eyes. "I'm lonely too," she said conversationally. "That's why I came. I thought maybe you wouldn't mind sharing." Sharing? Sharing what? His loneliness was not something to be parceled out like bread or coins. It was his burden to bear, his punishment for failing to protect the ones he loved most. This child understood nothing of loss, nothing of responsibility, nothing of the crushing weight that came with caring for others only to watch them die. "You know nothing," he said, but his voice had lost its bite. "Go home to your family." "I don't have a family," she replied matter-of-factly. "They died when I was little. That's why I live in the village with whoever will have me for a few days. Mrs. Aldwyn lets me sleep by her fire sometimes if I help with the washing. Baker Willem gives me old bread when his wife isn't looking. But mostly I just find places to stay warm." The casual way she spoke of her circumstances made Merek's throat tighten unexpectedly. Here was someone who had lost everything, just as he had. Yet she stood before him without bitterness or rage, offering to share her loneliness as if it were a gift rather than a curse. "That is unfortunate," he managed, "but it is not my concern. Return to the village." Instead of obeying, she took a step closer to him, craning her neck to maintain eye contact. "What's your name?" she asked. "I told you." "I am Duke Merek. No, I mean your real name. The one your mama called you when you were little." The question caught him so off guard that he actually answered. "Merek," he said, then immediately felt foolish for allowing such familiarity. "I'm Elin," she said, as if they were being properly introduced at some court function, rather than standing in a snowy courtyard where he was trying to frighten her away. "Can I see inside your castle? I've never been in one before." "Absolutely not." He turned to go, intending to leave her standing there until she gave up and went away. But something made him look back. Perhaps it was the way she had said his name. Not your grace or my lord, but simply Merek, as if they were equals. Perhaps it was the matter-of-fact way she had spoken of her orphaned state, or her strange fearlessness in the face of his reputation, or perhaps it was the way she stood there in the snow, small and alone, exactly as Rosalind might have stood if she had lived to grow up without protection. "Fine," he heard himself say, the word escaping before he could stop it. "You may see the castle briefly, then you will leave and not return." Ellen's face lit up with such genuine delight that Merek had to look away. When had he last seen joy that pure, that uncomplicated? Not since... No, he would not allow himself to think of that. He led her through the great entrance hall, past dust-covered furniture and faded tapestries. His footsteps echoed in the vast space, but hers made no sound at all, her bare feet padding silently across the stone floors like a cat's paws. She gazed around with wide eyes, taking in the carved pillars and high windows, the ancient weapons mounted on the walls, the cold fireplace that had once blazed with welcoming warmth. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But why is it so quiet?" "Because I prefer it that way." She accepted this without question, following him deeper into the castle. They passed through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch with disapproval as he brought this ragged child into their ancestral home. What would they think of what he had become? What would Lyanna think? Without conscious intention, his feet carried him toward the east wing, toward rooms he had not entered in 3 years. He realized his mistake only when they stood before a door he recognized with painful clarity, the entrance to what had once been the nursery. He should turn back. He should take the child to the kitchen, give her some food, and send her on her way. Instead, he found his hand reaching for the door handle, turning it with the slow deliberation of a man opening his own tomb. The nursery was exactly as it had been left that terrible autumn day. A small bed with carved wooden posts stood against one wall, its coverlet still rumpled from the last time Rosalind had slept in it. Toys lay scattered across the floor, wooden horses, cloth dolls, a miniature sword he had commissioned for her 6th birthday that would never come. Books sat open on a low table, their pages marking stories that would never be finished. And on the windowsill, gathering dust in a shaft of winter sunlight, sat a small music box, carved from rosewood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Ellen walked directly to it, as if drawn by some invisible thread. "What's this?" she asked, reaching out with careful fingers. "Don't touch that," Merek said sharply. But she had already lifted the delicate lid. The melody that spilled out was hauntingly beautiful. A lullaby Lyanna had hummed every night as she rocked their daughter to sleep. The notes seemed to fill not just the room, but Merek's entire chest, crushing his ribs with the weight of memory. He could see Lyanna clearly, her red-gold hair catching firelight as she sang. Rosalind's small fingers tangled in the fabric of her mother's gown as she drifted off to sleep. The music box had been a gift from his own mother, passed down through generations of daughters in his family. Lyanna had treasured it, winding it every evening as part of their daughter's bedtime ritual. The last time he had heard its song was the night before Rosalind fell ill, when the world still made sense and love still lived within these walls. Now the melody played on, sweet and merciless, and something inside Merek's chest began to fracture. The careful walls he had built around his heart started to crumble, and the grief he had transformed into rage came pouring out like water through a broken dam. He sank to his knees beside the small bed, his face buried in his hands, and wept as he had not wept since the day he laid his family in the ground. Great gasping sobs tore from his throat, raw and desperate and utterly without dignity. 3 years of bottled anguish spilled out onto the nursery floor, and he could no more stop it than he could stop the tide. Through his tears, he became dimly aware of small footsteps approaching. The music box fell silent, as Ellen closed its lid, but she said nothing about his breakdown, made no attempt to comfort him with empty words or awkward pats. Instead, she simply sat down beside him on the floor, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her small body, and waited. They sat together in the silence of the nursery, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter and love, while snow continued to fall outside the window. Gradually, Merek's sobs subsided into ragged breathing, then into something approaching calm. He raised his head, expecting to see pity or fear in the child's eyes, but found only quiet understanding. "They lived here," Ellen said, not a question but a statement of simple fact. "My wife and daughter," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "The plague took them." "I'm sorry," she said, and somehow those two words held more genuine sympathy than all the elaborate condolences he had received from nobles and clergy. "It hurts when people go away and don't come back." "Yes," he managed. "It does, but they're still here, aren't they?" She gestured around the room with one small hand. "All their things, all their love. It's still here waiting." Merek looked around the nursery with new eyes, seeing not just reminders of loss, but evidence of life lived fully and love given freely. For the first time in 3 years, the room felt less like a shrine to the dead and more like a place where joy had once dwelled. "Yes," he said again, the word carrying a different weight now. "I suppose it is." Ellen stood and walked to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass to peer out at the village below. "It's getting dark," she observed, "and it's still snowing." Merek followed her gaze and realized she was right. The short winter day was ending, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The path back to the village would be treacherous in the growing darkness, especially for a child with no shoes and inadequate clothing. He should send her away regardless. He should bundle her in one of his old cloaks and have the guards escort her safely back to whatever hovel would take her in for the night. That would be the sensible thing to do, the expected thing. Instead, he heard himself saying, "You may stay tonight. There are servants' quarters that can be made ready." Ellen turned from the window with a smile that transformed her entire face, making her look less like a beggar child and more like the sunlight that had been absent from his life for so long. "Thank you, Merek," she said, and something in the way she spoke his name, not with the fear or formality he had grown accustomed to, but with simple gratitude, made him realize that for the first time in 3 years, he had done something that felt right. As they left the nursery together, the music box sitting silent on its windowsill, Merek found himself wondering what other changes this strange, fearless child might bring to his carefully guarded solitude. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Dawn crept through the tall windows of Blackmore Keep like a hesitant visitor, casting pale light across corridors that had known only shadows for too long. Merek woke to an unfamiliar sound, the soft patter of bare feet on stone floors, accompanied by a voice humming a tune he didn't recognize. For a moment, caught between sleep and waking, he thought it might be Liana preparing for the day, and his heart lurched with painful hope before memory reasserted itself. Ellen, the orphan child, who had somehow talked her way into his castle and into the most protected chamber of his heart. He had given her a small room in the servants' quarters, provided her with clean blankets and a basin of warm water, even found an old dress that had belonged to one of the young maids who had fled his service. Yet here she was, awake before him, and apparently exploring his domain with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He found her in the great hall, standing before the massive fireplace, where portraits of his ancestors gazed down with stern dignity. She had managed to coax a small fire to life in the enormous hearth, and the orange light danced across her upturned face as she studied each painted figure with intense curiosity. "Good morning, Merek," she said without turning around, as if she had sensed his presence the moment he entered the room. "Are these your family?" He moved to stand beside her, following her gaze to the portraits that had watched over Blackmore Keep for generations. "My forebears," he confirmed, Dukes and duchesses of Eldenmere going back 300 years. They look important, Hélène observed, her head tilted as she examined a particularly stern-faced duke from the previous century. But they also look lonely. Do you think they were happy? It was such an unexpected question that Merek found himself actually considering it, rather than dismissing it outright. Had his ancestors been happy? He had grown up with stories of their great deeds, battles won, lands protected, alliances forged, but rarely had anyone spoken of their personal contentment or sorrow. I never thought to wonder, he admitted. Hélène nodded sagely, as if this were a perfectly reasonable response. Sometimes grown-ups forget to think about being happy. They get too busy thinking about being important. The observation stung with its simple truth. When had he last considered his own happiness as worthy of attention? Even before the plague, his days had been filled with duty, managing estates, settling disputes, planning defenses. He had found joy in Lyanna's laughter and Rosalind's games, but had he ever paused to simply appreciate his own contentment? "Are you hungry?" he asked, changing the subject to safer ground. Her face brightened immediately. "Always," she said with refreshing honesty. "But I don't want to be trouble." "You are already trouble," he replied, but there was no heat in the words. "Come, the kitchen should have something suitable." They made their way through corridors that felt different in her presence, less like a mausoleum and more like a home temporarily sleeping. Hélène chattered as they walked, asking questions about tapestries and suits of armor, commenting on the way sunlight fell through colored glass windows, pointing out details he had long since stopped noticing. The kitchen, when they reached it, was cold and largely empty. With no cook and only minimal staff, Merek had grown accustomed to simple fare, prepared by the guards or brought up from the village. But as Hélène explored the large room, with its massive stone hearths and hanging copper pots, he found himself seeing it through her eyes, not as a place of neglect, but as a space full of potential. "It's wonderful," she said, running her fingers along a wooden counter worn smooth by generations of use. "You could make so much food here, bread and stews and cakes," and she stopped abruptly, perhaps sensing she had ventured into territory that might bring pain. "My wife loved to cook," Merek said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. Not because she had to, but because she enjoyed it. She would spend hours in here, trying new recipes and laughing when they didn't turn out quite right. Ellen's eyes grew soft with understanding. "What did she like to make best?" "Honey cakes," he replied without hesitation. "She made them for Rosalind's naming day every year, with candied violets on top." The memory rose clear and sweet, untainted by the bitterness that usually accompanied thoughts of his lost family. "The whole castle would smell like cinnamon and flowers for days." "That sounds beautiful," Ellen said simply. And somehow her words didn't diminish the memory, but honored it. They broke their fast on bread and cheese. Simple fare that nonetheless felt like a feast when shared with someone who appreciated every bite. Ellen ate with the careful gratitude of someone who had known real hunger. But she also asked for seconds with the confidence of a child who trusted she would be provided for. As the morning progressed, Merek found himself drawn into a peculiar routine he hadn't experienced in years, showing someone around his home not as a duty, but as a pleasure. Hélène's wonder was infectious, her questions both innocent and surprisingly perceptive. She noticed things he had forgotten, the way morning light fell across the chapel's stone altar, the intricate carvings on the banister of the main staircase, the small garden courtyard where herbs still grew wild, despite 3 years of neglect. It was in this forgotten garden that they made their most significant discovery of the day. Hélène had wandered ahead while Merek cleared snow from a stone bench, and her delighted gasp drew his attention to a corner where someone had built a small shelter against the wall. "Look," she called, kneeling beside what appeared to be a miniature stable carved from wood and stone. "What is this?" Merek's breath caught as recognition flooded through him. He approached slowly, memory guiding his steps to the place where he had knelt 3 summers ago, helping small hands position carved animals in their proper places. "It's a toy stable," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I made it for Rosalind when she was 4. She loved horses more than anything else in the world. The wooden structure was weathered but intact, protected from the worst of the elements by its position against the castle wall. Inside, tiny carved horses stood where Rosalind had left them. Their painted coats faded, but their proud heads still held high. A wooden girl figure sat astride the largest horse, her carved face wearing a smile that perfectly captured his daughter's joy. Ellen reached out, then stopped herself. "May I touch them?" The question brought a fresh wave of grief, but also something else. A recognition that toys were meant to be played with, that joy was meant to be shared. Rosalind would not have wanted her treasures to stand forgotten and untouched, gathering dust like relics in a shrine. "Yes," he said, settling onto the snow-covered ground beside her. She would have liked that. What followed was perhaps the strangest hour of Merek's adult life. He found himself on his knees in the snow, helping Ellen arrange the carved animals in new configurations, explaining which horses were which and what games Rosalind had played with them. Ellen listened with rapt attention, adding her own stories about horses she had seen in the village, creating elaborate adventures for the wooden figures that had them galloping across imaginary kingdoms. At some point during their play, one of the remaining guards appeared at the garden entrance, his weathered face a study in bewilderment as he took in the sight of his lord, crouched in the snow, playing with toys alongside a ragged child. The guard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "there are villagers at the gate. They've come to inquire about the child." Merek felt Ellen tense beside him, her hands stilling on the carved horses. Of course, the village would have noticed her absence. Someone who had given her shelter would be worried, or perhaps they feared she had come to some harm at his hands. "What do they want?" he asked, not moving from his position in the snow. "To know if she's safe, Your Grace," and the guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with his message. "To offer to take her back if she's causing you trouble." The casual assumption that Ellen would naturally be trouble sparked an unexpected flare of anger in Merek's chest. This child who had shown more courage and kindness in one day than most adults managed in a lifetime, how dare they assume she was unwelcome? "Tell them," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded armies, "that Ellen is my guest and under my protection. She will remain here as long as she chooses." The guard's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he nodded and turned to go. Before he could leave, Ellen's small voice stopped him. "Could you tell Mrs. Aldwyn that I'm safe, and that I haven't forgotten to say my prayers?" The kindness in her concern for those who had shown her charity, even while she was clearly being offered something far better, struck Merek like a physical blow. When had he last shown such consideration for others? When had he last thought of anyone's well-being besides his own bitter isolation? After the guard left, they sat in comfortable silence among the toy horses, watching clouds gather for another storm. Ellen carefully arranged the wooden figures in a circle, as if they were having some important meeting, her face serious with concentration. "They're deciding something important," she explained when she noticed his attention. "The horses, I mean. They're trying to figure out how to help someone who's very sad." "And what do they decide?" Merek asked, genuinely curious about the workings of her imagination. Ellen looked up at him with those impossibly direct eyes. "They decide that sometimes the best way to help someone is just to stay close and be patient, even if it takes a very long time." The simple wisdom of her words settled into the quiet spaces of his heart like seeds in fertile ground. Patience. When had he last shown patience with anything, even his own grief? Yet here was this child, offering him exactly that, the gift of time and presence, without demands or expectations. "I think," he said slowly, "that those are very wise horses." "They are," Ellen agreed solemnly. They've had lots of practice being patient. As they gathered the wooden figures and returned them to their shelter, Merek realized that something fundamental had shifted during their morning together. The castle no longer felt like a prison of memory, but like a home that had simply been waiting for life to return to it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was no longer the bitter tyrant who had driven away everyone who cared for him. Perhaps he was simply a man who had forgotten how to live, and who was slowly being reminded by someone who had never forgotten how to hope. 3 weeks had passed since Ellen's arrival, and Blackmore Keep had begun to stir with a life it hadn't known in years. The child had settled into the castle's rhythms with the adaptability of someone accustomed to making herself at home wherever circumstances placed her. Yet she had also begun to change those rhythms in subtle ways that Merek was only beginning to understand. Each morning now began not with his solitary brooding, but with the sound of Ellen's voice, drifting through the corridors, sometimes humming, sometimes talking to herself, occasionally calling out questions that echoed off the stone walls until they reached wherever he happened to be. She had claimed the small chamber adjacent to the nursery as her own, and from there she had begun to explore every corner of the vast castle with the methodical thoroughness of a born explorer. It was on a grey morning, when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns, that Ellen made the discovery that would mark another turning point in their unexpected relationship. Merek found her in what had once been Lyanna's solar, sitting cross-legged on the floor before an open chest, carefully examining a leather-bound book. "I found these," she said without looking up, her voice hushed with the reverence children reserve for truly important discoveries. "There are so many of them." Merek approached slowly, recognizing the chest as one of several that contained Lyanna's personal belongings, things he had been unable to discard but too pained to examine. Inside, neatly arranged as his wife had left them, were dozens of books, not the weighty tomes of history and law that filled his own library, but smaller volumes bound in soft leather and cloth, collections of poetry, stories of distant lands, primers for teaching children their letters. "She loved to read," he said quietly, settling onto the floor beside Ellen, "and she believed everyone should have that joy." Ellen held up the book she had been examining, a primer decorated with painted animals and flowers, each page showing a different letter, accompanied by simple words and cheerful illustrations. "I can't read," she admitted without shame. "No one ever had time to teach me." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of this lack stirred something protective in Merek's chest. Reading had been as natural as breathing in his household. Lyanna had insisted that even the servants' children receive basic education, believing that knowledge belonged to everyone, not just the nobility. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, surprised by his own offer. Ellen's face transformed with such radiant joy that he had to look away. "Really, you would teach me?" He paused, uncertain what had prompted such an offer. "Yes, I suppose I could. Can we start now?" Her eagerness was infectious, and before he quite knew how it had happened, Merek found himself seated at the small table by the window, the primer open between them, beginning a lesson that would become the cornerstone of their daily routine. Ellen proved to be a remarkably quick student, her mind hungry for knowledge and her memory sharp as any blade. She approached each letter with the same fearless curiosity she had shown toward everything else in the castle, asking questions that demonstrated an understanding far beyond her years. "Why does this letter look angry?" she asked, pointing to a particularly stern-looking B in the illuminated manuscript. "Letters don't have feelings," Merek replied automatically, then paused as he really looked at the illustration. The artist had indeed given the letter a rather fierce expression, its curves and angles arranged in a way that suggested displeasure. "Although," he admitted, "I suppose this one does look rather cross. Maybe it's angry because it has to come after A all the time," Ellen suggested seriously. "It probably wants a turn being first." Such observations became a hallmark of their lessons. Ellen approached learning not as a chore to be endured, but as an adventure to be embraced, finding personality and story in everything from the shape of letters to the rhythm of simple words. Her enthusiasm began to reawaken in Merek a love of teaching he had forgotten he possessed. He had tutored Roslyn, of course, but those lessons had been brief and formal, supplementing the work of her governess with basic instruction in numbers and letters. This was different. Ellen's lack of formal education meant he had to be creative, finding ways to make abstract concepts concrete and memorable. He found himself drawing pictures in the margins of the primer, creating little stories to help her remember difficult words, even acting out the adventures of various letters when traditional methods failed. It was during one such lesson, as he found himself dramatically portraying the letter Q as a lonely character searching for its companion, U, that he realized something remarkable had happened. He was laughing, not the bitter, hollow sound that had occasionally escaped him during his worst moments, but genuine laughter born of shared joy and simple absurdity. Ellen's delighted giggles joined his own, and for a moment the solar filled with the kind of music that had once been commonplace within these walls. Their afternoon lessons became the bright center around which the rest of their days revolved. But they were not the only changes taking place within the castle. Word of Ellen's continued presence had spread through the village, and with it had come tentative overtures that Merek would have rejected outright just a month before. It began with Sarah, the baker's wife, who appeared at the castle gate one morning carrying a basket covered with clean linen. She was a sturdy woman in her middle years, with graying hair and kind eyes, that had watched Rosalind grow from baby to child. During the years when the castle had been a place of warmth and welcome, your grace, she said, when the guard brought word of her arrival, her voice carefully respectful, but lacking the tremor of fear that had marked all such interactions for the past 3 years. I've brought some things for the little one. Merek received her in the great hall, Ellen beside him, with her primer clutched in both hands like a shield. Sarah's gaze moved between them, taking in the sight of the once feared Duke sitting patiently while a child struggled to sound out words, and something in her expression softened. I thought she might need proper clothes, Sarah continued, lifting the linen to reveal a small dress of blue wool, clearly new-made and carefully stitched. And there are stockings and shoes that should fit well enough. That's beautiful, Ellen breathed, reaching out to touch the soft fabric with reverent fingers. Did you make it for me? I did indeed, little one, Sarah smiled. A growing girl needs proper attire, especially when she's learning her letters like a proper young lady. The casual acknowledgement of Ellen's education, the assumption that she deserved such consideration, struck Merek with unexpected force. When had anyone last spoken of his household, of him, with such warmth? This is very kind, he said carefully. What payment do you require? Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been hurt. There's no payment required, your grace. The child has need, and I have skill with needle and thread. Sometimes that's reason enough. It was, Merek realized, exactly the sort of generous spirit Lyanna had embodied, the kind of selfless care for others that had made her beloved throughout the village. He had forgotten that such people still existed, that kindness could be offered without expectation of reward. Then I thank you, he said, and meant it. Your kindness will not be forgotten. As Sarah took her leave, promising to return with more suitable clothing as Ellen grew, Merek found himself watching from the window as she made her way down the mountain path. Other villagers paused to speak with her, their heads turning toward the castle, as she undoubtedly shared news of what she had witnessed within its walls. She's nice, Ellen observed, carefully folding her new dress and stockings. She reminds me of someone who used to give me soup when I was smaller. Sarah has always been kind, Merek replied, then paused, struck by the implications of his own words. Always, not just today, but throughout the years, when he had chosen to see his people as burdens rather than blessings. How many other acts of kindness had he dismissed or ignored in his determination to remain isolated? That evening, as they shared a simple supper in the solar, another new tradition that had somehow established itself without conscious decision, Father Benedict appeared at the castle gate. The old priest had served the village for more than 20 years, baptizing Rosalind and officiating at Lyanna's funeral, weathering Merek's transformation from beloved lord to bitter tyrant with patient grace. I've come to see how the child fares, he said simply when Merek received him, his weathered hands folded peacefully before him. "The village has been curious. Ellen is well cared for," Merek replied stiffly, then was surprised when the priest smiled. "I can see that, my son. She looks healthier than I've seen her in months. And happier too." Father Benedict's gaze moved around the solar, taking in the books scattered on the table, the fire burning warmly in the grate, the general air of life that had returned to the space. "It seems the care has been mutual. I don't know what you mean, don't you?" The priest's eyes were kind but knowing. "When did you last smile before she came? When did you last think of anything beyond your own grief?" The questions struck too close to truth for comfort. But before Merek could form a defensive response, Ellen appeared in the doorway, her new dress smoothed carefully over her stockings, her dark hair braided with a ribbon Sarah had included in her basket. "Father Benedict!" she exclaimed with genuine delight, running to embrace the elderly priest with the casual affection of someone who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. "Look, I can read." What followed was a demonstration that filled Merek with an unexpected pride as Ellen carefully sounded out words from her primer, her finger following each letter with intense concentration. Father Benedict listened with the patience of someone accustomed to such performances, praising her progress and asking questions that showed he understood the magnitude of her achievement. "This is remarkable work," he said, looking meaningfully at Merek, both in the learning and the teaching. As the priest prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway of the solar, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said quietly, "Liana always said that love shared is love multiplied, never diminished. Perhaps she was wiser than any of us realized." After he had gone, Merek sat staring into the fire while Ellen practiced her letters at the table behind him. Love shared is love multiplied. Had his wife really said such a thing? He couldn't remember, but it sounded like something she would believe, something that would guide her generous heart. For 3 years he had hoarded his love like a miser hoards gold, convinced that caring again would diminish what he had felt for his lost family. But watching Ellen's joy in learning, feeling his own satisfaction in her progress, he began to wonder if perhaps the opposite might be true. Perhaps love was not a finite resource to be guarded and preserved, but a flame that grew brighter when shared. "Merek!" Ellen's voice broke into his thoughts. "Will you read me a story before sleep?" He turned to find her standing beside his chair, one of Liana's poetry books clutched against her chest, her eyes bright with hope and trust. 3 years ago, he would have refused such a request from anyone. Tonight he found himself nodding. "Choose whichever tale you like," he said, and settled back to listen as she carefully read the titles, her pronunciation still uncertain, but her determination absolute. Outside, snow began to fall again, but within the solar warmth and contentment reigned. For the first time since his family's death, Merek fell asleep to the sound of a child's voice, and his dreams were peaceful. Spring arrived at Eldenmere like a shy visitor, creeping through the mountain passes with hesitant warmth and the first brave shoots of green pushing through the last stubborn patches of snow. The change of season brought with it a restlessness that Merek hadn't felt in years, not the bitter agitation that had driven him to pace his empty halls like a caged beast, but something lighter and more hopeful. As if the world itself were whispering possibilities he had thought forever lost. Ellen felt it too, he could tell. She had taken to spending hours at the windows, watching for signs of life returning to the world outside. Her reading lessons had progressed remarkably in the weeks since they began, and she could now make her way through simple stories with only occasional help. But increasingly, her attention was drawn to the world beyond the castle walls, to the village below, where people emerged from their winter hibernation, to tend gardens and mend what the harsh season had damaged. It was on a morning when the sun actually felt warm, against the stone walls, that Ellen made the discovery that would change everything. Merek was in his study, reviewing estate ledgers that had grown dusty from neglect, when he heard an unusual sound echoing through the castle corridors. At first, he thought it might be one of the guards, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was the deep, resonant toll of the castle bell, a sound that had not been heard within these walls for 3 long years. He abandoned his ledgers and hurried toward the source of the sound, his heart beating with an anxiety he couldn't quite name. The bell tower was reached by a narrow spiral staircase that wound up through the castle's oldest section, and as he climbed, the tolling grew louder and more insistent. At the top of the stairs, he found Ellen standing on her toes to reach the bell rope, her small hands gripping the thick hemp as she pulled with all her might. Each pull sent another deep note ringing out across the valley, announcing to anyone within miles that Blackmore Keep was awake and aware. "Ellen," he called, his voice sharper than he intended. "What are you doing?" She turned toward him with a smile of pure delight, still clutching the rope. "I found it," she said breathlessly. "The bell was just sitting here, all lonely and quiet. I thought it might want to sing again." Merek moved to the narrow window that looked out over the village and felt his breath catch. People were emerging from their homes, looking up toward the castle with expressions of wonder and curiosity. Some pointed at the keep, others gathered in small groups as if discussing what the bell's voice might mean. It had been so long since any sound of life had come from his stronghold that its ringing was clearly an event of great significance. "Do you know," he said slowly, "the last time that bell rang was the day before your family." He stopped himself, unwilling to burden her with the weight of that memory, but Ellen's intuition was as sharp as ever. "The day before they got sick." "Yes," he admitted. Lyanna had the bell rung to call the village children for their reading lessons. She held them in the castle courtyard every week, teaching any child who wanted to learn. Ellen's eyes grew wide with understanding. "She taught children to read, like you're teaching me?" "She believed knowledge was a gift meant to be shared," Merek said, the words coming easier than he expected. "Every child in Eldenmere could read at least simple words because of her efforts, and then the bell stopped singing because she went away." Ellen said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to even the saddest truths. Yes, it seemed wrong to ring it when there was nothing to celebrate. Ellen considered this for a long moment. Her head tilted in the way that meant she was working through a particularly complex thought. "But there are still children in the village, aren't there? And they still need to learn." The simple observation hit Merek like a physical blow. Of course there were still children. Life hadn't stopped in Eldenmere just because his own world had ended. Those children Lyanna had taught would be grown now, but they would have siblings, cousins, children of their own, who had never known the joy of gathering in the castle courtyard to learn their letters. "I suppose there are," he said quietly. "Then maybe," Ellen said with the careful diplomacy of someone proposing something that might be rejected, "maybe the bell could sing again. Not the same song, but a new one." Before Merek could respond to this suggestion, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention back to the window. A rider was making his way up the winding path to the castle. Not one of the guards, but someone from the village, moving with the purposeful urgency of someone bearing important news. They descended the tower stairs together, Ellen chattering excitedly about the bell and its beautiful voice, while Merek's mind churned with possibilities and concerns. By the time they reached the great hall, the visitor had been admitted and stood waiting with the nervous energy of someone unsure of his reception. It was Thomas, his former steward, a man who had served the family for more than 20 years before Merek's grief-driven cruelty had finally driven him away. Thomas was older now, his hair gone completely grey and lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. But he stood straight and dignified as he had always done. "Your Grace," Thomas said carefully, inclining his head in a bow that held just the right amount of respect without subservience. "I hope I find you well, Thomas." Merek felt a complicated mix of emotions at seeing his old friend, shame for how he had treated him, gratitude that he had come, and an unexpected surge of affection for this steady, reliable man who had helped raise him from boyhood. "You are welcome here." "I heard the bell," Thomas said simply. The whole village heard it. People are curious. Are they angry? Ilden asked, with the directness that adults often found unsettling. Because I was the one who rang it. Thomas looked down at her with surprise, clearly not having expected to find a child in the Duke's hall. Then his expression softened into something approaching delight. Angry? Oh no, little miss. Hopeful, perhaps. Wondering if it might mean that better times are coming to Blackmoor Keep. It might, Ellen said seriously. Merek is much nicer than people think he is. He's teaching me to read, and he knows lots of stories. And he's not scary at all once you get used to him, the casual way she spoke of him, as if his reputation for cruelty were nothing more than a misunderstanding that could be easily corrected, brought a flush of warmth to Merek's chest. Through a child's eyes, he was not the tyrant of Eldenmere, but simply a man who told good stories and had patience for teaching. I'm glad to hear it, Thomas said gravely, as if receiving a report of great importance. The village has missed having a true lord to look to. Thomas, Merek said, finding his voice at last, I owe you an apology. The way I treated you, the things I said, there was no excuse for such behavior. The older man studied his face for a long moment, and Merek had the uncomfortable feeling that Thomas was seeing through 3 years of accumulated bitterness to the man who still existed beneath. Grief makes us do things we never thought ourselves capable of, Thomas said finally. Both good and ill. The question is what we choose to do when the worst of it passes. I've been thinking, Ellen said suddenly, as if the adult's serious conversation had reminded her of something important about the children in the village, the ones who need to learn reading like I'm learning. Both men looked down at her, and Merek felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. He had a feeling he knew where this was leading. What about them, little miss? Thomas asked kindly. Well, Merek is a very good teacher, and there are lots of books in the castle, and the bell could call them here just like it used to do. Maybe, she looked up at Merek with hopeful eyes, maybe we could have reading lessons for everyone. The suggestion hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning a chasm Merek wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Teaching Ellen was one thing. She was already here, already part of his daily life, already woven into the fabric of his carefully reconstructed existence. But opening the castle to the village children, inviting them into his sanctuary, deliberately choosing to engage with the community he had spurned for so long, that was something entirely different. That's a wonderful idea, Thomas said slowly, his eyes never leaving Merek's face. If His Grace were willing, of course. There are indeed children who could benefit from such instruction. I don't know, Merek began, then stopped as he saw Ellen's face fall slightly. Not with disappointment exactly, but with the careful acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. The expression reminded him painfully of his own resignation, and suddenly he understood that this moment was about more than reading lessons. This was about choosing to live again, to engage with the world beyond his grief, to risk caring about people who might be taken from him just as his family had been taken. It was about deciding whether the man who had loved Lyanna and Roslyn was truly dead or simply sleeping. Perhaps, he said carefully, we could try. A small group to begin with. Ellen's face blazed with such joy that Merek had to look away, but Thomas stepped forward with the eager efficiency of a man who had been waiting for such an opportunity. There are 6 children of proper age, he said quickly. Good children from good families eager to learn, and their parents would be, well, they would be grateful beyond words, Your Grace. Very well, Merek heard himself say, the words seeming to come from someone else entirely. Let it be known that reading lessons will resume at Blackmoor Keep. The bell will ring each morning after the noon meal to call those who wish to learn. When do we start? Ellen asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Merek looked around the great hall, seeing it suddenly not as a tomb of memory, but as a space that could once again ring with children's voices and laughter. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Tomorrow, he said, and felt as if he were stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. We'll start tomorrow. That evening, as word spread through the village that the Duke of Eldenmere would once again welcome children to his castle for lessons, Merek stood at his window, watching lights appear in cottage windows like stars coming out after a long darkness. Tomorrow would bring new voices to his halls, new faces to his table, new opportunities for both joy and heartbreak. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the sound of his castle bell had rung out across the valley. And the echo it left behind was not one of loss, but of possibility. Summer settled over Eldenmere like a gentle benediction, bringing with it changes that would have seemed impossible just months before. The castle that had stood silent and forbidding through 3 long years now echoed daily with the voices of children, their laughter bouncing off ancient stones that had forgotten how sweet such sounds could be. The reading lessons had begun tentatively, with just 4 children brave enough to answer the bell's call on that first nervous morning. Merek had prepared for the possibility of failure, steeling himself against the chance that fear of his reputation might prove stronger than desire for learning. Instead, he found himself facing a small group of wide-eyed youngsters who regarded him with the careful curiosity, reserved for something that might be dangerous but was probably just misunderstood. Ellen had been instrumental in making those first lessons a success. She served as translator between Merek's sometimes formal teaching style and the children's natural exuberance, explaining difficult concepts in ways her peers could understand, and demonstrating by example that the feared Duke was actually quite patient with mistakes and generous with praise for effort. Within a week, word had spread through the village that the lessons were not only safe, but genuinely useful. By the second week, 6 children attended regularly. By the third, Merek found himself teaching 8 eager students, ranging in age from 5 to 12, each bringing their own personality and challenges to the daily gatherings in the castle's great hall. It was during one of these lessons, as Merek helped young Willem sound out the words in a simple tale about a brave mouse, that Ellen made an announcement that would mark another turning point in their unlikely families. "Evolution, I want to make something special for you," she said, during their quiet time after the other children had gone home. They were sitting in the garden courtyard where her toy horses still held court, the wooden figures now joined by flowers she had planted in careful rows around their miniature stable. "What sort of something?" Merek asked, looking up from the slate where he had been working out lessons for the following day. Ellen's hands moved busily among the wildflowers that grew along the courtyard walls, selecting blooms with the serious concentration of an artist choosing colors for an important painting. Daisies, buttercups, tiny purple violets, and sprigs of something green and fragrant. She gathered them all with careful precision. "A crown," she said finally, beginning to weave the stems together with surprising skill. "Like the kings in the stories wear, but made of flowers because they're prettier than gold." Merek watched her small fingers work, remembering suddenly a day years ago when Roslin had done something very similar, though his daughter's efforts had resulted in a rather lopsided circlet that had fallen apart before he could properly admire it. Ellen's creation was taking shape with remarkable grace, the flowers forming a perfect circle that seemed to glow with captured sunlight. "Crowns are for royalty," he said gently. "I'm only a duke." "You're the most important person I know," Ellen replied matter-of-factly, not looking up from her work. "And besides, this is a special kind of crown. It's not for ruling kingdoms, it's for ruling hearts." The simple statement hit him with unexpected force. When had anyone last spoken of him ruling hearts rather than lands? When had anyone suggested that his value lay not in his title or his power, but in his capacity to inspire affection? Ellen finished her creation and held it up for inspection, her face glowing with pride. The crown was indeed beautiful, a perfect circle of summer's bounty that seemed to capture all the warmth and hope of the season. The flowers were woven together so skillfully that it looked as if they had grown that way, nature herself creating a symbol of beauty and joy. "It's magnificent," Merek said, and meant it. But I couldn't possibly. Please, Ellen interrupted, her eyes bright with hope. Just for today. Just so I can see what you look like wearing something happy. Something happy. When had he last worn anything that could be described in such terms? His clothing had been uniformly dark for 3 years, his expression perpetually stern, his entire bearing designed to warn others away rather than welcome them close. But here was this child asking him to wear flowers in his hair, to look happy instead of fearsome, to be the sort of man who could accept a gift made of love rather than duty. Very well, he said, bowing his head so she could place the crown upon it. But only because you ask so nicely. Ellen's delighted giggle as she settled the flowered circle on his head was worth any embarrassment he might have felt. She stepped back to admire her handiwork, clapping her hands together with satisfaction. Perfect, she pronounced. Now you look like the real you, the real you. Merek found himself wondering what she meant by that. What version of himself she saw when she looked at him with those 2 wise eyes. Was there truly a real Merek beneath the grief and anger and bitter isolation? And if so, what did that man look like? They were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and Merek turned to see Father Benedict entering the garden courtyard, his weathered face creased in a smile of genuine warmth. The priest's eyes took in the scene, the Duke of Eldenmere, sitting cross-legged in the dirt wearing a crown of wildflowers while a small girl arranged toy horses nearby, and his smile widened into something approaching delight, Your Grace, Father Benedict said with exaggerated formality, inclining his head in a bow that was only slightly mocking. I see you've acquired some new regalia. Ellen made it, Merek replied, resisting the urge to remove the crown immediately. She has considerable skill with flowers. I can see that, the priest agreed, settling himself on a nearby stone bench with the careful movements of age. It suits you remarkably well. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching Ellen create elaborate adventures for her wooden horses, while bees hummed among the flowers and afternoon sunlight painted everything in shades of gold. It was, Merek realized, the first time in years that he had simply existed in a moment without trying to escape it or endure it, just enjoying the simple pleasure of being present in his own life. The village is talking, Father Benedict said eventually, his tone carefully neutral. About what? Merek asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. About the reading lessons. About the changes at the castle. About you. The priest paused, his keen eyes studying Merek's face. They're saying you're becoming yourself again. I was never anyone else, weren't you? Father Benedict's voice was gentle but pointed. The man who drove away everyone who cared for him, who ruled through fear rather than love, who locked himself away from the world. That wasn't the Merek I knew. That was grief wearing your face. The observation stung because it was true. For 3 years, he had been a shadow of himself, a hollow echo of the man who had once been known for his fairness, his protection of the weak, his genuine care for those under his rule. He had become what his pain had made him rather than what his nature intended. And now, he asked, now you wear flower crowns and teach children to read. Father Benedict smiled. Now you sit in gardens and watch toy horses have adventures. Now you look like a man who remembers what joy feels like. It's frightening, Merek admitted quietly, glancing to make sure Ellen was still absorbed in her play. Caring again. Letting people close. What if you lose them? The priest finished. What if caring leads to more pain? Yes. Father Benedict was quiet for a long moment, watching a butterfly settle on one of Ellen's flowers. You know, he said finally, I performed your wedding ceremony. I remember the vows you spoke to Lyanna, the promises you made about love and faithfulness and cherishing each other for all your days. Yes, Merek said again, the memory bringing both warmth and ache. Did you ever regret loving her? Even knowing how it ended, would you choose differently if you could? The question required no thought. Never. Loving Lyanna and Rosalind was the best thing I ever did, even if losing them nearly destroyed me. Then perhaps, Father Benedict said gently, the question isn't whether you might lose again, but whether you can afford not to love while you have the chance. Before Merek could respond to this wisdom, Elin appeared beside them carrying her crown of flowers. Now somewhat wilted from the day's heat, but still beautiful in its simple perfection. "Father Benedict, would you like a crown too?" she asked seriously. "I could make you one, but it would have to be different from Merek's, because you're different kinds of important." "What kind of important am I?" the priest asked with grave interest. Ellen considered this carefully. "You're important to people's hearts, like Merek, but also to their spirits. So your crown should have something holy in it. And what would make it holy?" "Herbs," Ellen said promptly. "The ones that smell good when you burn them in church. And maybe some rosemary for remembering, and mint for healing." Father Benedict's eyes crinkled with delight. "I would be honored to wear such a crown, child." As Hélène scampered off to gather materials for the priest's coronation, Merek found himself alone with his old friend in the growing twilight. The flower crown sat lightly on his head, and he realized he had forgotten he was wearing it. It had become simply part of the moment, part of the peace that had settled over the garden like a blessing. "She sees goodness in everyone," he said wonderingly. "She sees truth," Father Benedict corrected. "The goodness was always there in you and in everyone else. She simply isn't afraid to acknowledge it." They remained in the garden until full darkness fell, wearing their flower crowns like the regalia of some ancient religion dedicated to joy and simple pleasures. When Hélène finally fell asleep leaning against Merek's shoulder, her small hand still clutching a sprig of mint, he carried her inside with infinite gentleness, leaving the crowns on the garden bench to return to the earth that had created them. But the feeling they represented, the lightness, the permission to be happy, the recognition that love shared was indeed love multiplied, that stayed with him long into the night and through the dreams that followed. For the first time in 3 years, Duke Merek of Eldenmere went to sleep wearing a smile. The day of the midsummer festival dawned bright and clear, with a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of wildflowers across the valley. For the first time in 3 years, Duke Merek found himself preparing to join the village celebration. A decision that would have been unthinkable just months before, but which now felt as natural as breathing. Ellen had been chattering about the festival for weeks, her excitement infectious as she described the music, dancing and feasting that marked the year's longest day. She had never attended a proper festival, having spent her short life on the margins of such celebrations, but her anticipation was bright enough to illuminate every corner of the castle. "Will there really be musicians?" she asked for the 10th time as they made their way down the mountain path toward the village square. "And dancing? And cakes with honey? All of that and more," Merek assured her, adjusting the small pack that contained their contribution to the feast. Honey cakes made from Lyanna's recipe, recreated with Thomas's help, and imbued with memories both sweet and bittersweet. The village square had been transformed for the occasion. Colorful banners fluttered from every building, long tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, and a space had been cleared for dancing where musicians were already tuning their instruments. The sight brought a rush of memories so vivid that Merek had to pause in his steps. Other festivals, other years, when he had arrived with Lyanna on his arm and Rosalind dancing ahead of them, eager to join the celebration. But this year he had Ellen, and her wonder at everything she saw helped transform nostalgia into something warmer and more present. She pointed at the flower garlands, exclaimed over the array of food, and waved shyly at the other children from their reading lessons who called out greetings as they passed. The villagers' reception of their duke was cautious but warm. Months of seeing the changes at the castle, of hearing their children's excited reports about the reading lessons, had gradually shifted the atmosphere from fear to hopeful curiosity. Now they offered respectful bows mixed with genuine smiles, and several stepped forward to thank him personally for the education their children were receiving. "Your Grace," said Willem the baker, his weathered hands clasped before him, "my grandson speaks of nothing but his letters now. You've given him a gift that will last his whole life. He's a bright boy, Merek replied, surprised by how naturally the praise came. "He has a gift for storytelling that reminds me of the old bards." Such conversations multiplied as the day progressed, each interaction rebuilding bridges that had been burned by 3 years of mutual mistrust and fear. Merek found himself remembering names and faces, asking after families and crops, offering advice and assistance with the easy authority of someone who genuinely cared about his people's welfare. As evening approached and the dancing began, Ellen tugged insistently at his sleeve. "Will you dance with me?" she asked, her eyes bright with hope and anticipation. The request should have terrified him. Dancing meant joy, celebration, the kind of public display of happiness that felt like a betrayal of his lost family's memory. But looking down at Ellen's expectant face, he found he couldn't refuse. "I'm not much of a dancer anymore," he warned, as he led her onto the makeshift dance floor. "That's all right," she said seriously. "I don't know how to dance at all, so we can learn together." What followed was perhaps the most healing hour of Merek's adult life. They spun and stepped to the ancient folk melodies, Ellen's laughter ringing out as he lifted her high in the traditional moves, his own smile growing wider with each song. Other couples joined them, villagers who had once scattered at his approach, now dancing beside him as if he were simply another neighbor celebrating the season's height. During a particularly lively reel, Merek caught sight of something that made his breath catch. There, dancing with surprising grace despite his age, was Father Benedict, and in his arms was a woman Merek recognized as the village seamstress. But what struck him most powerfully was the expression on the priest's face. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The same expression Merek could feel on his own features as he swung Ellen around the circle. This was what Lyanna had loved about the festivals, he realized. Not the pageantry or tradition, but the simple human connection, the way an entire community could come together in celebration of life itself. She would have wanted him to be here, would have wanted him to find this happiness again. As the music ended and they stood catching their breath, Ellen looked up at him with shining eyes. "This is the best day ever," she declared with the absolute certainty that only children could muster. "Yes," Merek agreed, meaning it completely. "I believe it is." It was at that moment of perfect contentment that disaster struck. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the evening's joy like a blade through silk. A royal messenger appeared at the edge of the square, his horse lathered with sweat and his livery bearing the unmistakable crest of the crown. Behind him rode 2 other men, nobles by their bearing and dress, their faces grim with purpose. The music died away as the messenger dismounted and approached the center of the square where Merek stood with Ellen still at his side. In the sudden silence, the man's voice carried clearly to every corner of the gathering. "I seek Duke Merek of Eldenmere," he announced formally. "I am he," Merek replied, stepping forward with the instinctive authority of someone accustomed to command. Though his heart had begun beating with anxious rhythm, the messenger produced a scroll sealed with royal wax and held it out with grave ceremony. "By order of His Majesty King Edmund, I bear this royal decree." Merek accepted the document with steady hands, though inside he felt the familiar chill of approaching catastrophe. Royal messengers rarely brought good news, especially not to remote duchies during times of celebration. He broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, his eyes scanning the formal language with growing horror. The words swam before him like poison in clear water. Claims of his death in recent border conflicts. Testimony from distant relatives asserting his demise. Legal documents transferring his titles and lands to cousins he barely knew. A royal judgment accepting these claims based on reliable evidence and witness testimony. According to the Crown, Duke Merek of Eldenmere was dead. "This is impossible," he said, his voice cutting through the silent square like a whip crack. "I stand before you very much alive." One of the nobles who had accompanied the messenger stepped forward, a man with cold eyes and expensive clothes who regarded Merek with the calculating assessment of someone evaluating an obstacle to be removed. Lord Aldrich of Westmarch. The man introduced himself with a mocking bow. cousin to the late Duke Merek, and by royal decree, the new Duke of Eldenmere. Late? The word escaped Merek like a growl. I am very much present and alive, as any person with eyes can attest. Are you? Aldrich's smile was sharp as winter frost. We have multiple witnesses who saw Duke Merek fall in battle against northern raiders 3 months past. We have testimony from his own men-at-arms confirming his death. We have lies, Merek snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward where his sword would have hung if he were not at a peaceful festival. Complete fabrications, perhaps, Aldrich agreed with infuriating calm. But they are lies supported by royal seal and accepted by the crown. Unless you can prove your identity and your continued existence to the king's satisfaction, this decree stands. The implications crashed over Merek like an avalanche. His lands, his title, his very identity, all stripped away by legal maneuvering and false testimony. But worse than that, far worse, was what it would mean for Ellen. As if reading his thoughts, Eldric's gaze moved to the child, who still stood beside him, her small hand gripping his arm with white-knuckled intensity. As for the foundling who has been living at the castle, he said with casual cruelty, arrangements will be made for her proper placement in a workhouse or orphanage. The new management cannot be expected to house every stray that wanders onto the estate. No. The word tore from Merek's throat with such force that several villagers stepped back in alarm. You will not touch her. I'm afraid that decision is no longer yours to make, Aldrich replied smoothly. According to this decree, you have no legal standing here whatsoever. You are, in the eyes of the law, a dead man. The square erupted in voices, villagers protesting, demanding explanations, shouting their support for the man they had come to trust and respect. But Merek heard none of it over the roaring in his ears and the sound of Ellen's frightened breathing beside him. This was his worst nightmare made manifest, not just the loss of everything he had rebuilt, but the threat to the one person who had brought light back into his darkness. 3 years ago, such a blow would have driven him to his knees with despair. Now, with Ellen's hand in his, and the taste of happiness still fresh on his tongue, it filled him with a fury so pure and focused that it burned away every trace of the broken man he had been. Very well, he said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had once made enemies flee before him on battlefields. If I must prove my identity and my right to live, then so be it. But know this, cousin. He spat the last word like a curse. You have awakened something you are not prepared to face. Aldrich's confident smile flickered slightly at the tone, but he recovered quickly. You have until the next full moon to present your case before the king in the capital, he said formally. Until then, by royal decree, you will remove yourself from these lands and take nothing that belongs to the Duchy of Eldenmere. And the child, Merek asked, though he already knew the answer, remains here to be dealt with according to law. No, Ellen said suddenly, her voice small but clear in the tense silence. I won't go anywhere without Merek. Aldrich looked down at her with the kind of dismissive contempt reserved for insects. Children don't make such choices, girl. You'll go where you're told and be grateful for it. It was, Merek realized later, exactly the wrong thing to say to someone who had spent her entire life defying the expectations of adults who underestimated her courage. My name is Ellen, she said, lifting her chin with a dignity that would have done credit to any duchess. And I choose to stay with my family. The word family hit Merek like a physical blow, filling him with a fierce protectiveness that made his earlier fury seem pale by comparison. This child, this brave, wonderful child who had pulled him back from the edge of despair, was his family now. Not by blood or law, but by choice and love, and the kind of bond that could not be broken by royal decrees or false testimony. Then you leave me no choice, he said quietly, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. I will go to the capital. I will prove my identity, and I will return for what is mine. See that you do, Aldrich said with false confidence, though I doubt we'll see you again once you realize the futility of your position. As the royal party prepared to take their leave, leaving behind a village in turmoil and a festival turned to ash, Merek knelt beside Ellen and took her small face in his hands. Listen to me carefully, he said urgently. I have to go away for a while, but I promise you, I swear on everything I hold sacred, I will come back for you. I know, she said simply, and the absolute trust in her voice nearly broke his heart. You're my family now. Families don't leave each other. No, Merek thought as he rose to face the greatest challenge of his life, they don't, and he would move heaven and earth to prove it. The dawn that followed the ruined festival brought with it a cold that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with the hollow ache of impending separation. Merek stood in his solar, methodically gathering the documents and tokens that might serve as proof of his identity, while Ellen sat curled in the window seat, watching his every movement with the intensity of someone trying to memorize each detail. How long will you be gone? She asked for the third time, her voice carefully controlled in the way of children who are trying very hard to be brave. I don't know, Merek replied honestly, setting Lyanna's wedding ring into a small leather pouch, alongside his military commendations and the seal that had belonged to his father. The journey to the capital alone will take nearly a week, and then there will be time needed to present my case to the king's court. But you will come back, she said, not a question but a statement of absolute faith that humbled him. I will come back, he confirmed, kneeling beside her at the window. Nothing in this world could keep me from returning to you, Ellen. You have my word as a knight, my promise as a duke, and my oath as— He paused, the words catching in his throat before he forced them out. As your father, the term hung between them like a bridge finally acknowledged, spanning the distance between what they had been to each other and what they had become. Ellen's eyes filled with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. I've never had a father before, she whispered, and I had forgotten what it meant to be one, Merek replied, gathering her into his arms with infinite gentleness. But some things once learned are never truly lost. A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. Thomas had arrived with a small cart and several trusted men from the village, their faces grim with purpose. Word of the previous night's events had spread through Eldenmere like wildfire, and the response had been swift and decisive. Your Grace, Thomas called up to the solar window, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. We've brought what you'll need for the journey. What followed was the most humbling hour of Merek's life. One by one, the people of Eldenmere came forward with offerings for his quest. Not tribute demanded by a lord, but gifts freely given by friends. Sarah, the baker's wife, brought a traveling pack filled with provisions that would last for weeks. Father Benedict contributed a letter bearing the church's seal, testifying to Merek's identity and character. Young Willem's father, a man who worked the quarries, pressed a small bag of silver coins into his hands. For bribes or necessities, the man said gruffly. Court folk don't do anything for free, and you'll need every advantage you can get. Most precious of all was the document Thomas presented, a carefully written testimony signed by every adult in the village, attesting to Merek's identity, his presence among them for all the years in question, and his character as both lord and man. The parchment was covered with shaky X's from those who could not write their names. But each mark represented a voice raised in his defense. We remember who you were before grief changed you, Thomas said quietly as Merek examined the document with wonder. And we see who you've become since hope returned. That man is worth fighting for. The words struck deeper than any royal proclamation or noble title ever could. These people had seen him at his worst, had suffered under his cruel indifference, yet they were willing to stand with him when everything hung in the balance. Their faith in him was more precious than any crown. As the time for departure drew near, Ellen made her own contribution to his quest. She pressed a small object into his palm, something wrapped in soft cloth that fit perfectly in his closed fist. It's for when you get lonely, she said seriously. To remember that someone is waiting for you to come home. Merek unwrapped the cloth to reveal Lyanna's wedding ring. The simple gold band he had carried as proof of his identity now transformed into something far more powerful. Elin had threaded it onto a leather cord, creating a pendant that could rest close to his heart. This was your mother's ring, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was going to use it to prove who I am." "You don't need it for that," Ellen replied, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that never failed to astound him. "You have a whole village full of people who know who you are, but you might need it to remember who you're fighting for." The distinction was subtle but profound. He wasn't just fighting to prove his legal identity. He was fighting for the right to be the man he had become, the father he had chosen to be, the protector of something infinitely more valuable than lands or titles. As he prepared to mount his horse for the long journey ahead, Father Benedict approached with one final gift, a small wooden cross that had belonged to the old priest's own father. "For protection," the elderly man said simply, "and for remembrance that faith can move mountains, even when those mountains seem insurmountable." "Thank you," Merek said, accepting the cross with reverence. "All of you. I won't forget this." "See that you don't," Thomas replied with a slight smile. "And see that you return to us whole and victorious. We have reading lessons to resume and festivals to celebrate properly." The farewell with Ellen was the hardest thing Merek had done since burying his first family. She stood straight and brave in the courtyard, her chin lifted with determination, but her small hands trembled as she waved goodbye. He forced himself not to look back as he rode down the mountain path, knowing that seeing her growing smaller in the distance would shatter his resolve. The journey to the capital stretched before him like a test of endurance, both physical and emotional. Each mile that separated him from Eldenmere felt like a weight added to his chest, making breathing difficult and sleep fitful. He pushed hard, stopping only when his horse required rest. Driven by the knowledge that every day away was another day, Ellen spent under the shadow of uncertainty. As he rode, Merek found his mind turning over the impossible situation he faced. How did one prove one's own existence to a court that had already accepted testimony of one's death? What evidence could he present that his enemies had not already anticipated and countered? The leather cord around his neck provided constant comfort, Lyanna's ring resting warm against his chest with each heartbeat. When doubt threatened to overwhelm him, he would touch the small circle of gold and remember Ellen's faith, the village's support, the love that had grown from shared sorrow into something stronger than any legal document. On the third day of travel, he encountered another rider on the road, a merchant heading away from the capital with news that chilled Merek's blood. King Edmund was ill, possibly dying, and his court was in chaos as various factions maneuvered for position. Justice, the merchant warned, was becoming a commodity bought and sold rather than something dispensed with fairness. "Unless you have gold or powerful friends," the man advised, "I'd avoid the capital altogether. It's no place for honest folk seeking honest judgment, but retreat was not an option." Somewhere behind him, Ellen waited with the trust of someone who had never known a promise to be broken. Somewhere ahead lay the only chance to reclaim not just his title and lands, but his right to be her father, her protector, her family. As the capital's towers finally came into view on the horizon, Merek touched the ring at his throat once more and whispered a prayer that was part plea, part promise, and part declaration of war against anyone who would try to separate him from the child who had become his heart. The real battle was about to begin. The royal court of King Edmund bore little resemblance to the noble institution Merek remembered from his younger days. Where once dignity and justice had reigned, now whispered conspiracies and barely concealed greed poisoned the very air. Courtiers clustered in small groups, their conversations dying whenever a stranger approached, their eyes calculating the worth of every newcomer with the cold assessment of merchants at market. Merek stood in the vast throne room, still travel-stained and wearing the simple clothes of his journey, while around him swirled a sea of silk and velvet that marked the difference between his current status and theirs. At the far end of the hall, King Edmund sat slumped in his throne, a man clearly diminished by illness, his once powerful frame now gaunt, and his eyes holding the distant look of someone whose attention was increasingly turned inward. Before the throne, Speaking with animated gestures and false sincerity stood Lord Aldrich and his companions. They had clearly been presenting their case for some time, their voices carrying the confidence of men who believed their victory was already assured. And so, "Your Majesty," Aldrich was saying, his tone perfectly pitched to suggest reasonable concern, "we come before you, seeking only to fulfill our duty to the crown and to the people of Eldenmere. The death of Duke Merek, tragic though it was, cannot be allowed to leave the duchy without proper leadership. Tell us again of these witnesses," the king said wearily, his voice barely carrying across the vast space. "Those who saw him fall? 3 of his own men-at-arms, Your Majesty, all reliable soldiers who served under him for years. They testified that he died fighting valiantly against northern raiders, his body lost in the river when the bridge collapsed. A hero's death, to be sure, but death nonetheless." Merek felt his jaw clench at the elaborate fiction. The alleged battle had never taken place. The bridge Aldrich described didn't exist, and the men-at-arms were either bought, threatened, or entirely fictional. But presented with such confidence and supporting documents, the lies had the weight of truth, and you, Lord Aldrich, the king continued, as his nearest kin, are prepared to assume the burdens of ruling Eldenmere. With heavy heart but willing spirit, Your Majesty. The people deserve leadership, and I am prepared to provide it. It was then that the herald's voice rang out across the throne room. "Merek, claiming to be Duke of Eldenmere, seeks audience with His Majesty." The announcement sent ripples of shock through the assembled court. Conversations died mid-sentence, heads turned toward the entrance, and Aldrich's face went white before flushing red with rage. "Impossible," he sputtered. "This is clearly an impostor, some desperate pretender hoping to—" "Let him approach," the king commanded. And for a moment, his voice carried an echo of the authority that had once made him feared and respected across the realm. Merek walked the length of the throne room with measured steps, feeling hundreds of eyes upon him, hearing the whispers that followed in his wake. He had faced charging armies with less trepidation than he felt now, knowing that everything, Ellen's future, his own identity, the trust of everyone who had believed in him, rested on the next few minutes. When he reached the prescribed distance from the throne, he dropped to one knee in the formal gesture of respect, then rose to meet the king's gaze directly. "Your Majesty," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "I am Merek, rightful Duke of Eldenmere, very much alive and seeking justice against those who would steal my lands and a title through fraud and deception." King Edmund studied him with eyes that still held keen intelligence, despite his physical decline. "You claim to be a dead man," the monarch said slowly. "That is a most unusual position to argue from. I claim to be exactly who I've always been, Your Majesty. If I may present evidence of my identity and the falseness of these claims against me." "Proceed," the king said, settling back in his throne, with what might have been interest or merely the resignation of a man too weary to care deeply about anything. Merek reached into his traveling pack and withdrew the documents and tokens he had gathered, his father's seal, military commendations, the testimonial from his village, letters bearing his authentic signature. One by one, he presented them to the court scribe, explaining their significance with the calm authority of someone presenting facts rather than pleading for mercy. "These prove nothing," Aldrich interrupted, his composure returning as he realized the challenge he faced. "Documents can be forged, seals can be stolen, testimonials can be bought. We have 3 sworn witnesses to this man's death, soldiers who served under the real Duke Merek for years." "And where are these witnesses?" Merek asked pointedly. "I see none here to testify in person. They are indisposed. The trauma of watching their lord die has affected them greatly." "How convenient," Merek replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to suggest what he thought of such an excuse. "Perhaps if they were present, they could explain how they witnessed my death when I have been living peacefully in my castle for the past 3 years. Teaching village children to read and tending my gardens." Murmurs rippled through the court at this unexpected detail. Whatever they had expected from a man claiming to return from the dead, domestic activities were clearly not among them. "Gardens?" the king asked, with what might have been amusement. "You tend gardens?" "Among other things, your majesty. A duke's duties are not limited to warfare and taxation. Tell us of these other duties," the king commanded. And Merek found himself describing the life he had built in the months since Ellen's arrival, the reading lessons, the renewed connections with his people, the simple pleasure of watching a child discover the joy of learning. "This is all very touching," Aldrich said, with barely concealed impatience. "But it proves nothing. Anyone could claim such activities. We need proof of identity, not stories of domestic bliss." "You want proof?" Merek asked, his hand moving to the leather cord around his neck. "Then let me present something that cannot be forged or stolen or explained away by clever lies." He drew forth Lyanna's ring, the simple gold band catching the light from the throne room's tall windows. But it was not the ring itself that mattered. It was what he did next. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying a new note of authority, "this ring bears an inscription placed there by the royal goldsmith on the occasion of my marriage to Lady Lyanna of Rosemere. The inscription reads, M.L. Eternum, Merek and Lyanna forever. It was blessed by your own chaplain in this very court 15 years ago when you honored us both by attending our wedding ceremony." The king leaned forward, sudden interest sharpening his features. "Bring me that ring," he commanded. As the court scribe carried the ring to the throne, Merek continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You spoke at our wedding feast, your majesty. You told us that love was the only wealth that grew when shared, and you drank a toast to our happiness with wine from your own private reserves." King Edmund examined the ring carefully, his fingers tracing the tiny inscription with the familiarity of someone who remembered commissioning it. When he looked up at Merek again, his eyes held recognition. "I remember," he said slowly. "Lady Lyanna wore blue silk that day, and you could hardly speak your vows for looking at her. She laughed when you stumbled over the words, and the whole court laughed with her. She always said I was better with a sword than with speeches," Merek replied, feeling the truth of the memory warm his chest, "though she was kind enough to pretend otherwise. And she died in the plague," the king continued, his voice softer now. "Along with your daughter. I sent condolences, though I feared they brought little comfort. They brought more than you know, your majesty. But grief nearly destroyed me, and I became a man I barely recognized, bitter, cruel, driving away everyone who tried to help. It was only when a small orphan girl showed me that love could exist without diminishing what came. Before that, I found my way back to myself." The description of his transformation rang with such authentic pain and hope that even the most cynical courtiers fell silent. This was not the polished presentation of a skilled liar, but the raw honesty of someone who had looked into the abyss and returned to tell of it. The silence that followed Merek's testimony stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the soft rustle of silk as courtiers shifted nervously in their places. King Edmund continued to study the wedding ring, turning it slowly in his weathered fingers, and Merek could see the moment when memory crystallized into certainty. "Lord Aldrich," the king said finally, his voice carrying a note of steel that had been absent earlier, "you claim to have witnesses to Duke Merek's death, yet the man himself stands before us wearing his wife's ring and speaking of memories only he could possess. How do you explain this contradiction?" Eldric's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady as he replied, "Your Majesty, I can only repeat what I have been told by reliable witnesses." "Perhaps this man learned these details through what?" The king interrupted. "Did he steal memories along with the ring? Did he somehow divine the exact words I spoke at a wedding feast 15 years past?" Before Aldrich could respond, a commotion at the throne room's entrance drew every eye. A court page was hurrying forward, clearly agitated, carrying what appeared to be a letter bearing travel stains and urgent seals. "Your Majesty," the page said breathlessly as he approached the throne, "a urgent message has arrived from the Duchy of Eldenmere. The king accepted the letter with raised eyebrows, breaking the seal with practiced efficiency. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something approaching wonder. "Most interesting," he murmured, then looked up at the assembled court with eyes that now held definite amusement. "It seems we have received additional testimony regarding this matter." He held up the letter so all could see its official seals and careful script. "This missive comes from one Ellen of Eldenmere, ward of Duke Merek, aged 6 years, written in her own hand, with assistance from Father Benedict of the village church." A ripple of astonishment passed through the court. Whatever they had expected, testimony from a 6-year-old child was clearly not among the possibilities they had considered. "The letter reads," the king continued, his voice carrying clearly across the vast hall, "as follows: to His Majesty the King, from Ellen who lives in the castle. I'm writing to tell you that Merek is my father, and he is not dead because I see him every day. He teaches me to read and makes honey cakes and tells me stories about my mother, who used to live here before the sickness took her. He is the kindest man in the world, and he promised to come home to me. Families don't leave each other. Please tell the mean men to go away so my father can come home. I miss him very much. Your faithful subject, Ellen." The innocence and directness of the child's words struck the court like a physical blow. Here was testimony that could not be questioned, coached, or bought, the simple truth of a child's love for her father, expressed with the clarity that only complete honesty could provide. "Furthermore," the king continued, "this letter is accompanied by testimonials from every adult resident of Eldenmere village, attesting not only to Duke Merek's continued existence, but to his presence among them throughout the period when he was allegedly dead. Father Benedict adds his own testimony regarding the Duke's character and his care for the child Ellen, whom he describes as the daughter of his heart, if not his blood." Merek felt his throat tighten at these words. Daughter of his heart. Yes, that was exactly what Ellen had become, not a replacement for Roslyn, but a new kind of love, different but equally precious. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said desperately, "surely the testimony of a child and a collection of peasants cannot outweigh the sworn statements of trained soldiers, can it not?" The king's voice had grown dangerously quiet. "Tell me, Lord Aldrich, these soldiers who witnessed Duke Merek's heroic death, what were their names?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Eldrich's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Their names were, that is, they are, yes?" The king prompted with deadly patience. "Sir William of Hartwell, Sir James the Bold, and Sir Robert of Millbridge," Aldrich stammered, clearly making up the names as he spoke. King Edmund's expression shifted to one of cold fury. "Sir James the Bold?" he repeated slowly. "You claim Sir James the Bold witnessed Duke Merek's death 3 months ago?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Aldrich replied, though his voice had begun to shake. "That is most remarkable," the king said, rising from his throne with more energy than he had shown all day. "Considering that Sir James the Bold died in my service 5 years ago, I was present at his funeral. I spoke at his memorial service. His widow still receives a pension from the crown." The accusation fell upon the court like a thunderclap. Gasps and whispers erupted from every corner of the throne room as the full scope of Aldrich's deception became clear. "You dare to invoke the name of a dead hero in service of your lies?" The king's voice had risen to a roar that echoed off the stone walls. "You would steal lands and titles through fraud, fabrication, and the desecration of a good man's memory." "Your Majesty, I can explain—" Aldrich began, but the king cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "You can explain nothing. Your deception is exposed, your witnesses are phantoms, and your claims are revealed as the lies they always were." The king turned his attention back to Merek, and his expression softened considerably. "Duke Merek of Eldenmere, I restore to you all titles, lands, and privileges that are rightfully yours. Furthermore, I hereby grant you full legal custody of the child Ellen, recognizing her as your daughter and heir in the eyes of the crown." Relief flooded through Merek like warm wine, making his knees weak and his vision blur with unshed tears. Ellen was safe. His title was restored. The threat that had hung over everything he cherished was lifted as suddenly as it had descended. As for you, Lord Aldrich, the king continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of royal displeasure, you will be confined pending investigation of your crimes. Fraud against the crown, perjury before the royal court, and attempted theft of noble lands carry severe penalties. Your Majesty, please, Aldrich began. But guards were already moving to escort him away. As the false claimant was led from the throne room in disgrace, King Edmund beckoned Merek forward. When he was close enough for private conversation, the monarch's expression grew thoughtful. You know, he said quietly, when I heard you had died, I felt the loss deeply. You were one of the few nobles I trusted completely, and your death would have been a great blow to the realm. I'm more pleased than I can express to find those reports were false. Thank you, Your Majesty. Your faith in me has always been a source of strength. See that you continue to deserve it, the king replied with a slight smile. And give my regards to your daughter. Her letter was the most honest piece of testimony this court has heard in years. As Merek prepared to take his leave, the king added one final comment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. You know, Duke Merek, I think perhaps this Ellen has saved you in more ways than one. A man who can inspire such devotion in a child, who can transform from bitter isolation to loving father, that is a man worth preserving. Yes, Your Majesty, Merek replied, touching the ring that still hung around his neck. She most certainly has. With justice served and his rights restored, Duke Merek of Eldenmere began the journey home to the child who waited for him, and to the life they would build together as a family. The bells of Eldenmere rang out across the valley as Duke Merek crested the final hill on his journey home, their joyous pealing announcing his return to anyone within miles. But it was not the sound of bronze and iron that made his heart race. It was the sight of a small figure in a blue dress standing at the castle gate, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she watched the road with unwavering patience. Ellen. She had been waiting, just as she had promised, just as he had known she would be. Even from a distance, he could see the moment she recognized him, could see her entire body straighten with joy. Before she began running down the path toward him with the reckless abandon of someone whose faith had been justified, Merek dismounted while his horse was still moving, catching Ellen as she launched herself into his arms with enough force to nearly knock him backward. She wrapped her small arms around his neck with desperate intensity, her face buried against his shoulder as if she could make him disappear again simply by holding on tight enough. You came back, she whispered, her voice muffled but audible. I knew you would, but I was still scared you might not. I promised I would, Merek replied, his own voice rough with emotion as he held her close. And I told you families don't leave each other. Never again? She asked, pulling back just enough to search his face with those impossibly direct eyes. Never again, he confirmed solemnly. We're bound together now, you and I, by choice and by love and by royal decree. Nothing can separate us. They stood there in the road for a long moment, father and daughter reunited, while around them the village of Eldenmere burst into spontaneous celebration. Word of the Duke's vindication had apparently preceded him, carried by swift messengers, and now people emerged from their homes and shops to line the path up to the castle, their faces bright with genuine joy. Thomas was waiting at the castle gate, with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, and behind him stood Father Benedict, Sarah the baker's wife, Willem and his family, and what appeared to be every person in the village who could walk. They had come not as subjects greeting their lord, but as friends welcoming home someone they loved. Your Grace, Thomas said formally, then abandoned all pretense of ceremony and embraced him with the fierce affection of an old friend. Welcome home. It's good to be home, Merek replied, and meant it with every fibre of his being. Though I think perhaps we can dispense with the formalities. After everything we've been through together, surely we're simply friends and family. The celebration that followed would be remembered in Eldenmere for generations. Tables were hastily assembled in the castle's great hall. Food appeared as if by magic from every household in the village, and the ancient stones rang with laughter and music and the sound of dozens of conversations happening at once. But for Merek, the most precious moment came later that evening, when the last guest had departed, and he sat in his solar with Hélène curled against his side, both of them exhausted but content. On the table before them lay an official document bearing the royal seal, the formal papers recognizing Ellen as his daughter and heir, making legal what had already been true in their hearts. "What does it say?" Ellen asked, tracing the elaborate calligraphy with one small finger. Her reading had improved dramatically during his absence, but royal documents were still beyond her current skill. "It says," Merek replied carefully, "that you are officially Lady Ellen of Eldenmere, my daughter and heir to all my titles and lands. It says that in the eyes of the law, the crown, and God himself, we are family." Ellen considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Does that mean I have to learn to be a lady now? With fancy dresses and curtsies and all those complicated rules?" "It means," Merek said with a smile, "that you get to choose what kind of lady you want to be. You can wear fancy dresses if you like them, or simple ones if you prefer. You can learn courtly manners, or you can be the kind of duchess who teaches village children to read and makes flower crowns, and isn't afraid to get dirt under her fingernails." "I think I'd like to be that kind," Ellen said thoughtfully. "The kind who remembers that being important means helping people, not making them afraid." The wisdom of her words struck Merek like a physical blow. Here was a 6-year-old child who understood leadership better than most adults ever would. That true nobility came not from birth or titles, but from service to others, from using whatever power one possessed to lift up rather than suppress. "I think that would make you the best kind of duchess imaginable," he said softly. As the weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, the changes at Blackmore Keep became a source of wonder throughout the duchy. The reading lessons resumed with even greater enthusiasm, now formally recognized as the Lady Ellen's Academy for Young Scholars. Children came not just from Eldenmere, but from surrounding villages, drawn by the reputation of the Duke who taught alongside, his daughter, and the promise that education was freely given to any child who desired it. The castle itself seemed to come alive in ways that went beyond the simple return of servants and routine. Gardens that had lain fallow for years burst into bloom under Hélène's enthusiastic care. Corridors that had echoed with emptiness now rang with the voices of children who had permission to explore and play. The great hall, which had stood silent for so long, once again hosted regular feasts where noble and commoner sat side by side, sharing food and stories with equal pleasure. Perhaps most remarkably, Merek found himself becoming the kind of lord he had never thought to be, not just a protector and administrator, but a genuine leader who knew his people by name and cared about their individual struggles and triumphs. Hélène's influence had awakened in him an understanding that true strength came from connection rather than isolation, that a ruler's greatest weapon was not fear, but love. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after Ellen had first knocked at his gate, Merek stood once again at the window of his solar. But this time he was not alone, and the scene below was not one of loneliness and despair, but of abundant life. In the courtyard, Hélène was conducting an impromptu lesson for a group of young children, using her toy horses to act out the adventures of letters and numbers. Her laughter floated up to the window like music, joined by the delighted giggles of her students. On the wall beside the window, in a place of honor where he would see it every day, hung a new portrait, not of long-dead ancestors, but of a living family. The artist had captured them perfectly. Merek in his simple clothes, with his hand resting protectively on Ellen's shoulder, and Ellen herself looking directly out of the frame, with those fearless eyes that had seen past his anger to the man beneath. They looked, he thought with satisfaction, exactly like what they were, a father and daughter who had found each other across the ruins of separate griefs and built something beautiful together. "Merek," Ellen's voice called from the courtyard below. "Come and help us! The letter Q is being stubborn again, and the children think you tell better stories about him than I do." With a laugh that would have been impossible just a year before, Duke Merek of Eldenmere abandoned his contemplation and hurried down to join his daughter in the courtyard, where toys and children and laughter waited to remind him once again that the greatest treasures in life were not gold or titles or power, but the simple miracle of love freely given and gratefully received. The bells of Eldenmere continued to ring across the valley, but now they rang not with sorrow or fear, but with joy, the sound of a family restored, a community renewed, and a love that had proven stronger than grief, deeper than loss, and more enduring than any royal decree. In the end, it had taken only the courage of one small girl to teach a broken man that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with swords or armies, but with the simple willingness to believe that every heart, no matter how damaged, still holds the capacity for healing.